In this episode of Truth Uncoiled, we are going to talk about the Karen Reed case. It just came to conclusion, and it makes sense that we kind of walk through it so we can talk about the legalese of this because this case was crazy. And unfortunately, it ended in a mistrial because the jurors could not come to a consensus of guilty fully or not guilty. And so this is going to happen all over from the beginning. So stay tuned. This case kind of garnered a lot of attention when the trial started on April 16th. Before that, I had actually never even heard of the case. It was localized to Boston. Obviously, people in Massachusetts really knew about it, but it just hadn't really trickled over here. And we didn't know what was going on. But now that all of the evidence has come out in the trial, to summarize, what happened was John O'Keefe was Karen Reed's boyfriend. And on the night of January 29th, 2022, he was found dead on the front lawn of a friend's house in the middle of the night. Immediately, the police believed that Karen Reed, his then girlfriend, was the culprit. To make this story even a little bit more convoluted, is John O'Keefe was a police officer of the Boston Police Department. It was believed that the police department basically pinpointed Karen because there was a lot of people that knew what happened but needed to cover it up because like police officers fight for police officers, brother before brother kind of thing. The prosecutors were determined it's Karen Reed, even though there was horrible things that happened with the evidence, and I'll talk a little bit about that. They took it through trial and they were convinced that they were going to be able to get a jury that was going to convict her. And after weeks of testimony and evidence, and the defense basically poking holes in so much of the legitimacy of the evidence, of testimonies, of timelines, the jury went out and for 3 days deliberated. And they could not get a unanimous decision. And when that happens, when you get a few people that say not guilty and a few people that say guilty, and there is nothing that is going to change their mind, the judge had he had nothing else he could do but grant a mistrial. And immediately, once the mistrial was announced, the prosecution said, "We're going to try her again." I mean, the prosecutors are determined that Karen Reed was the one that killed him. Immediately after the mistrial, the lead detective in the case was dismissed. Now, he was supposedly a huge key, obviously, in the prosecution's case because he was the lead prosecutor or lead detective on the case. And he led the investigation. I mean, obviously, a major player in the prosecution's case. And he was dismissed. And why? Because he got so many problems with his investigation that would lead somebody to think, wow, this was not done properly, or this was absolutely either a cover up, which is what Karen Reed's defense counsel, their entire case was Karen Reed didn't kill him. There was a major cover up. The investigation was botched from the beginning, and therefore Karen Reed cannot be found guilty. And the defense counsel said, "It's not my job to figure out who killed him. That's your job." But Karen Reed did not do it. So that was their biggest case. One of the things that I thought was the most interesting about this case is when the mistrial came, I'm going to guess, and they haven't broken down like how many jurors said that she was guilty and how many jurors said she was not guilty. But I'm going to guess there was one or two holdouts. One or two people were like, she is guilty. And the remainder of the people were like, there's no way she did this because, or not that they said she couldn't do that. There was so much reasonable doubt because of the botched investigation and the botched evidence that in my thought, I was like, well, if majority of the people say that she's not guilty, and you're that one person or two people that say, no, she's guilty, is that in itself not reasonable doubt? And therefore, couldn't they then say, well, because not everybody can find that she's guilty, then reasonable doubt exists, and therefore I have to find her not guilty. I think that's an interesting take. Once the jurors, said mistrial, and the jurors can willfully talk. The gag order goes away. There's nothing keeping them from talking to the media. But as of right now, we haven't heard a lot. And I think it's because I just don't think we're going to hear a lot. I think that those jurors don't want to be known because there is so much conspiracy, speculation, anger around this case. And so if I was a juror, I wouldn't want anybody to know who I was, no matter what. So let's talk a little bit about the case. The night he died, So shortly after midnight, Karen Reed and John O'Keefe and a group of friends went to the Waterfall Bar and Grill and in Canton on the night of January 28th. They were drinking, they were consuming lots of drinks, and then they drove over to Boston's police officer's home, Brian Albert. And this is where she said that a lot of people were meeting up from the bar and that they were going to continue their party or whatever. There was evidence that prior to this, the weeks prior, that there was text messages and voicemails that came out that Karen Reed and her boyfriend O'Keefe were their relationship was strained and they were fighting. Reed allegedly left voicemails that said, you're an effing loser, F yourself, and I effing hate you. Like, pretty intense, right? So at 4:23 a.m. that morning, heavy snow was falling. O'Keefe's niece called Jennifer McCabe, who is Brian Albert's sister-in-law and friend of O'Keefe's, and she said Reed was distraught because O'Keefe had not come home and was not answering his cell phone. According to the documents, McCabe said that she heard Reed scream, John didn't come home. We had a fight around 5 a.m. Now, Reed called another woman whose husband was friends with O'Keefe, and prosecutors allege that Reed said while they searched, what if he's dead? So she said that. Or what if a plow hit him? I don't remember anything from last night. We drank too much and I don't remember anything. So that was like the evidence that the prosecution like put on this plot, and this her motive was, they were mad at each other and they were fighting. So that's when they started like looking for him. It was about 5 a.m. in the morning. Also, Karen Reed had mentioned to this woman that she had cracked her tail light and wondered if she could have hit O'Keefe. She says that. But there is a surveillance video that shows that that she came really close or hit O'Keefe's SUV in the driveway. And that was a major piece of evidence that was used from the prosecutors to show that Karen had a broken tail light and therefore she must have hit O'Keefe. But then the defense said no, she hit his car. And here's the evidence. So there was a lot of back and forth on that piece of evidence. And it's interesting because then it was then that they find O'Keefe lying in the snow outside Brian Albert's home. And Reed was the one who found him. And she was hysterical and she was obviously inconsolable. And she was saying, I hit him, I hit him. The defense says that that first responders testimony that that's what Karen said was false, that never happened. But that was the testimony that basically was used in the grand jury to indict her. What's interesting is there was a piece of evidence where that the prosecutors and defense attorneys agree that at some point the morning O'Keefe was killed, someone Googled how long to die in the cold. And the sides disagree on when the search was made. Prosecutors say the search happened at like 6:23 a.m. and 6:24 a.m. after O'Keefe's body was found. The defense says a federal forensic expert determined the search was made at 2:27 a.m. before police were alerted that O'Keefe's body had been found. So just from the beginning of this, I mean, there was problems with the evidence. And what's crazy about this case is that when you kind of you do find that there is a ton of impropriety, like not just like the difference in what the defense argues, the prosecutor argues to the different evidence, but how he died. Like the police say they found a broken cocktail glass and a piece of tail light at the scene. A forensic toxicologist estimated that Reed's blood count would have been around 0.13 to 0.29 around 12:45, more than the legal limit. And when the autopsy was completed, prosecutors said the medical examiner ruled the cause of death was blunt impact injuries to the head and hypothermia. And obviously that was a major dispute, right? Because they said that if O'Keefe backed into him with a tail light, like how would that have tragically hit his head? And the defense had expert testimony to say that there's, that it is inconceivable that him hitting the car where the tail light was broken would be the cause of his death. So just major discrepancies in that piece of evidence, which is clearly a major piece of evidence, right? The grand jury on June 10th, they charged her with second-degree murder manslaughter, which means that there was not any premeditated thought to murder him. So it was done there was no where I sit here and I ponder and I think, how am I going to murder him? To go forward and then to act that out. But they then changed that and actually charged her with first degree murder. So they basically went then from from second-degree murder to first-degree murder, saying she did plan this. This was all planned out, even though they were drinking all night. It was in May of 2023 when the defense attorneys started saying that Karen Reed was being framed, that this involved a fight. There was a fight inside Brian Albert's home. This is where they went, drinking, that they claim O'Keefe was beaten and his body was later dumped outside. Karen's attorneys, they focused on wounds of O'Keefe's arms, which they said showed he was attacked by a dog during the fight. And they argued hard. I mean, they the prosecutions were fishing so hard to say that Karen Reed was the murderer. And it's interesting because if you look at this case from an outside lens, I mean, it didn't look like they investigated anybody else but Karen Reed, which in my mind, I think was a fatal flaw in this, because I think there is a lot of contradictory evidence. And obviously the prosecution says there's no evidence that, O'Keefe was beaten and left for dead. But so as they go through a lot of evidence, but we're going back to that lead detective who was released from the case after the case. I think a lot of evidence, his testimony on the stand was, I think, the most egregious. There was text messages that they found on his private phone that said that he had looked through Karen Reed's phone for nudes, that he had said that he hopes that she, kills herself, that he then makes some inappropriate comment that she's hot but unhinged or something like that. I mean, just stuff that is just so unsettling, makes you just like pit in your stomach. And clearly that's why the prosecutors were like, okay, he needs to be released from this case when we retry this. But again, I don't know how he is key to the case because he's the lead investigator. So I don't know how they're going to do this next phase of another trial without him. And again, it's just going to be all his impropriety, his improper way of investigating this case is going to be front and center for the defense. The other interesting thing is when you are given a mistrial, you have to retrial the case. Well, now everything's out there, right? Everything's out there. The testimonies, what's going to be played at court. Well, now the defense counsel can just use all of that information and go even deeper in poking the holes in the theories of the prosecution. I mean, when you have a mistrial and you have to retrial, it makes the prosecution's job so much harder. So, some of the evidence that was under scrutiny is that the prosecutor said they have DNA evidence recovered from the broken tail light that implicates Reed in O'Keefe's death. They said the tail light in the same material from Reed's SUV and that the DNA matched O'Keefe's. He also said broken taillight material was found on O'Keefe's clothing. Reed's defense team said that the federal investigation in the case led to an FBI expert concluding that evidence does not support the theory that O'Keefe died after being hit by the SUV. Damage on the car was inconsistent with having made contact with his body. In other words, the car didn't hit him, and he wasn't hit by a car. Then also, the Massachusetts State Police said they had opened an internal investigation into potential violation of department policy. This was by Trooper Michael Proctor, who I told you was the lead investigator on the case, and he's been taken off now. So with all of that, there's doctor video evidence that there was proven that there was doctor video evidence. I mean, just a lot of things. Again, to show that it's to keep the scales of justice balanced. Like if the prosecutors are going to try to cheat, lie to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt, that's the defense team to keep it honest and to keep it fair, correct? And that's what they're doing. And there is a lot of like back and forth of she did it, she didn't do it. And it's really, really interesting. So now that there's been an official mistrial, we'll see when the trial is going to go forward, what's going to happen. It's going to be interesting to see how the prosecutors go about trying this again. Man, this case has just blown my mind into the way that it was done. It does question into the whole sanctity of an investigation. I mean, did he get different treatment? Was it a cover up because he was a police officer? There's so much to that. And then the question is, why was Karen Reed upgraded from second degree murder to first degree? You know, questions behind that. There's just a lot of questions. If there are a lot of questions, as looking at it from a legal lens, that means there is reasonable doubt. And a lot of the questions can't be answered because there's so much back and forth. And it's a matter of who do you believe more, right? But there's been so much impropriety within the investigation. It's pretty hard to believe them. But then also, you just take Karen Reed's statement as true. That's the hard part. A lot of doubt. Very interesting. We'll talk about it if it goes back to trial and we'll see what's going to happen. But truth uncoiled, just interesting about the Karen Reed case. Make sure you follow us on YouTube. Next week's episode is going to be absolutely fascinating as well.